Thank you, Pierre. Well, if you have a Bible, please turn to Mark chapter 14. One of the worst experiences is preparing for the wrong thing. You study for the wrong test. You read the wrong book for the book report, and then write the report, and then stand up and give the book report, and then your teacher says, that's the wrong book. You prepare a prototype with the wrong specifications. You prepare a presentation for a client. That's not what they want. You go to court to plead your case, not knowing all the latest legal decisions. You feel ready, and then you find out you are not. And in Mark's gospel, we see the disciples continually preparing for the wrong thing, or not being prepared for what they think is the right thing. And so we see earlier on in Mark's gospel, they're in a boat and they have one loaf of bread. And Jesus has just right before multiplied bread for the crowds, and they start discussing and arguing, oops, did we not bring enough bread? Or we see them trying to stop people who are following Jesus who don't follow them, as if they're preparing this little group of people. That's the in crowd, the right people. They're arguing over who is the greatest. James and John even come to Jesus asking for the privilege of sitting next to him on his throne. But Jesus, time and time and again, is preparing them for something else. And as Pierre pointed out to me earlier this week, in Mark 14, Jesus is also preparing from the beginning of the chapter. He's preparing for his death. And so in the first few verses of Mark 14, his body is anointed for burial. And then later on in the chapter, he celebrates Passover with the disciples, and he is preparing them to understand what's about to happen on the cross. How his body will be broken and his blood will be shed for his people. He is preparing for his death. And what then will be the last step of his preparation? What is the heart of his struggle, of our struggle? As we think about what the Lord would have us do, let us see how our shepherd has walked before us. Be reading Mark 14, beginning in verse 26 through 52. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Peter said to him, "Even though they all fall away, I will not." And Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said emphatically, "If I must die with you, I will not deny you." And they all said the same. And they went to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." And he came and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. And immediately while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, the one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard. And when he came, he went up to him at once and said, Rabbi, and he kissed him. And they laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled. And they all left him and fled. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. And so we see now the final step of Christ's preparation for the cross, the betrayal, the death that he has been telling his disciples about. We saw in chapter 8 of Mark, chapter 9 of Mark, chapter 10 of Mark. He's been talking about this. And as the hour for his betrayal is drawing near, what does he do? He bows the knee and submits to the will of the Father. And that is the heart of our struggle, of all who would follow after Christ. And we can throw ourselves into the struggle to submit to the Father's will by fixing our eyes on our shepherd, who, as we see, has gone before us. It's easy for our eyes to be veiled to our situation, to see things wrongly. Like we're looking at a funhouse mirror. Have you ever seen a funhouse mirror? Like the mirror's all wonky and shapy. And so you look at it, and you're as big as your dad because the mirror is so funny. It's easy for us to look at our situation and see things funny. The disciples are not seeing the sovereign for who he is. As we see in these first few verses, 26 to 31. What would you do if you knew for certain that a major biblical event was happening in your lifetime or in this day? I mean, people are even arguing about that right now, right? What's going on in the world? Maybe you've had some friends, or maybe you've even thought like, wow, the world seems to be falling apart. Maybe Jesus will be coming back soon. Now, Jesus did say in Mark 13, we don't know when he's coming back. But the disciples have something very unique, don't they? Because Jesus, in verse 27, quotes an Old Testament prophecy and says, it's happening right now. He's quoting Zechariah 13:7, which reads, awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. And Jesus is telling them, right now, this is what the prophets have predicted. The Lord himself will unsheath his sword and strike me. And my followers will all be scattered. And their response? Nuh-uh. Right? Peter said to him, even though they all fall away, I will not. Just like before, in Mark chapter 10, when James and John came to Jesus, they don't actually know what they're talking about. Jesus said that to James and John. You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink or be baptized with the baptism with which I'm to be baptized? And they said to him, we are. They have a clear word from our Lord, from the creator of the universe. And they say, nuh-uh. I'm the one who's sovereign. I'm the one who's writing my own story. Rather than turn to God for mercy, they fall over each other to insist, no, it's me. I'm the one who can endure. I'm the special one. They don't see the struggle for what it is. They still think this is some kind of competition, right? Oh yeah, he's not going to do it, but I will. She's not as faithful, but I am. He hasn't done as much for the kingdom as I have. They keep preparing for the wrong thing. Just like in chapter 9, Jesus came to a house and he asked them, what were you talking about on the way? But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. They think the struggle is with others, other disciples, other people. They're not seeing the shepherd for who he is. And here's the core of Mark's gospel. A question raised in chapter 8, verse 29, halfway through. Jesus asks to his disciples and to you, who do you say that I am? Peter at that time answers, the Christ. But as we talked about in Sunday school, you can get the word right and the definition wrong. And so the second half then of Mark's gospel is telling us, who is the Christ? Who is he? And we see now, beginning in verse 32, his heart. Our eyes are now opened to the heart of Christ. And we even have a hint at this, right? He comes to Gethsemane, he's with his disciples, and then he goes off with, who? Who does it say? And he took with him Peter and James and John. And if we read Mark, that's a clue about what's about to happen. Because in chapter 5, he took Peter and James and John only with him, and he raised someone back from the dead. And then in chapter 9, he took only Peter and James and John with him to the top of a mountain, and he was transfigured, and his glory shone out. And so now he takes Peter and James and John with him. What will we see this time? What could be on par with Jesus raising someone from the dead, or the glory of God radiating from him? The glory of his submission. Which really is Mark's whole argument. And so what do we see in Jesus' struggle? Well, we see something, first of all, in this first time as he's overwhelmed with sorrow. He collapses on the ground and he prays to God. We see something that we really even have a hard time expressing in language, in human language. That the God who is one and exists in three persons, this relationship between the Son and the Father. We try to teach the doctrine of the Trinity to one another and to kids, and we really struggle with it because it's something that's beyond us. And Mark is pressing our faces in And even though God has no parts in him, there's something about the relationship between the Son and the Father that's taking up the entire screen here. That Christ submitted his will to the Father completely. He knows what's coming better than anyone else. Right? Sometimes you don't listen to your parents. You don't do what they've asked you to do, and you know you're in trouble, but you're not sure what will happen. What do I deserve? How are they going to discipline me? Jesus knows what sin is. He knows what it is better than us. We like to define sin by comparison to others and to justify ourselves. And so, yes, sometimes we have right anger at the injustices in the world and the suffering, but we're still tempted to think we don't deserve what they deserve. We've seen time and time again Jesus speak of the heart of man, of the fountain of sin that it is. Or in chapter 9, how he talks about what sin deserves. In the middle of chapter 9, more towards the end, he says, "Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a great millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea." And then he goes on 3 times to talk about hell with its unquenchable fire, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. He knows what sin is. He knows better than any of us the wrath it rightly deserves. He knows it means separation from the Father. And he has told his disciples and told us that is what he will endure, even though he does not deserve it. His temptation then is real. He suffered. Hebrews puts it this way, because he himself has suffered when tempted. And he was tempted not to turn to the Father, just like the disciples. And yet, in the midst of that, what do you do when you're struggling, suffering, in pain? After he turns to the Father, he turns to the disciples, and he shepherds them. In the midst of unbearable agony and suffering, staring over the precipice of hell, he turns and he cares for his sheep. And he comes to Peter, the one who had been so boastful, finds him sleeping. The one who had promised that he will be with him till the end could not even stay awake 1 hour. And he shepherds him. Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And he's saying that from experience. We see in the struggle of Christ one who shares our nature. The divine Son who shares our nature. And we see his repeated struggle. How strong do you think the power of temptation is? Maybe we could ask some of the kids, how strong do you think your dad is? Super strong, yeah! Right? And have you ever arm wrestled your dad? No. You're like, I don't even know if I want to try. Right? Because as kids, a lot of time, we don't actually know how strong our dad is because we try to arm wrestle him, and it only goes this far. C.S. Lewis wrote this: "Only those who try to resist temptation know how strong it is. We never find out the strength of the evil impulse inside us until we try to fight it." And so sometimes we arm wrestle our dads and we give up. Because I can't go any farther. And a lot of times we wrestle against temptation and we give up. And so we don't actually know how strong it is. It feels overwhelming, but we haven't even pushed it to the limit. And here is Christ struggling again and again. And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." How long do you think the struggle against temptation lasts? Have you ever thought about these words from Hebrews 12:4? "In your struggle against sin, you have not resisted to the point of shedding your blood. It lasts until you die." Because we're not wrestling with others. We're wrestling with our weak human nature, which refuses to submit to the Father. And so we should not be surprised then when we struggle, or at least tempted in the same ways again and again and again. Yet again, there's confusion at work about whether I'll be keeping my job or not. Yet again, I'm struggling to figure out how I'm going to provide for my family. Yet again, this sin rears its ugly head. But here we see our shepherd, the one who not only shares our nature, but struggled again and again against our nature. And what do we see then in his finished struggle as he comes the third time and says, "It is enough, the hour has come"? Well, C.S. Lewis continued on to say, Christ, because he was the only man who never yielded to temptation, is also the only man who knows to the full what temptation means. Or as the verse before Hebrews 12:4, verse 3 says, "Considered him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted." He did it. Christ, who shares our nature, who struggled against our human nature, completely submitted to the will of the Father, fought temptation to the very end, to the cross. Because we've seen in Mark, when he calms a storm, when he casts out demons, when he brings someone back from the dead, if he didn't want to go to the cross, he wouldn't have. If he gave in to temptation and said, "I'm going to run," he would have made it away. But now, his preparation is complete. He has submitted his will to the Father. He will soon offer up his body to be crucified, but here in Gethsemane, he has offered up his soul. Do you see then the goodness of the shepherd who shares our weakness? That even in unbearable anguish, he is shepherding his sheep. He is teaching us through Peter and James and John. He is teaching them, knowing that they are going to flee. He doesn't go, "Okay, well, you're going to run away anyway, so I'm just going to go over here and pray by myself." He knows what Elaine went through in her final moments. He knows what our brothers and sisters in Ukraine are going through right now. He knows the struggles and the pain that you go through. Not on an intellectual level like us who are reading our Twitters, our news feeds, and seeing what's happened in Ukraine. And yes, we imagine that would be tough. He knows. As Hebrews 4:15 says, we do not have a great high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. He emerges victorious in the heart of the struggle. And now that we see Christ rightly, our eyes are open to the reality that we face. As the betrayer and the crowd come, will we always see danger coming? Can you predict that? Can you predict what tomorrow will bring? Whether one nation will invade another? Whether you'll have your job? Whether your church planting plan will go through and your core members will stay on your team? The disciples had no clue who's going to betray them. Jesus has been saying over and over again, I'm going to be betrayed. He even, at the first part of chapter 14 says, it's going to be one of you guys. And they all go, oh yeah, Judas was a really lousy disciple. No. There was no hint. I think it was Tim Keller who pointed out, no one was like, yeah, Judas's demons were really slow to be cast out. Or like, people didn't, they still had sneezes left after he cured them of their cold. Nothing like that. As Jeremiah 17:9 says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? Christ. That's the answer, Christ. He knew. We see time and time again in Mark, he knows what is in the heart of man, of you. And we even see in chapter 3, he chose Judas to be one of the 12. And so he is not surprised by what is going on. He's not surprised by dictators elbowing their way into another country, or the betrayals that might happen at work or in our family. He is not flabbergasted or hoodwinked by false submission, as Judas does, coming to him with a sign of loyalty and submission, a kiss. Will we always know what is best to do? There's confusion and chaos going on here, right? Kind of like when a pillow fight breaks out at your house. You don't even know who's hitting who. It's so fast. Verse 47 talks about one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant. Mark doesn't even say who that is. The other disciples tell us. Mark's giving us this picture of just all happening so fast. Some guy whips out his sword. Confusion and chaos that we experience day in and day out. Our shepherd knows what's going on. He's keeping a level head. He sees things as they are, right? This great statement. Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day, I was with you in the temple, but you didn't seize me. He knows exactly what's going on. But Psalm 75 that Nathan read for us is etched on his heart. For not from the east or from the west, and not from the wilderness comes lifting up, but it is God who executes judgment, putting down one and lifting up another. That what looks like confusion and chaos to us, the Lord is still sovereign over. Talk to an older saint. Go, treat them to coffee or a nice meal. I'm sure that they will tell you the road they have walked is not always the one you were planning on, right? The way that God leads us through the years is not always how we expect it will go. Will we always be faithful to Christ? The disciples thought so. They all said the same thing, I will never deny you. And they all left Christ and fled. He will always be faithful to us, though. He goes to the cross to serve those who fled. He goes to the cross to serve those who betrayed him. We see that in chapter 16. He goes to the cross to serve the one who executes him. So that when his executioner, chapter 15, when his executioner, the centurion standing in front of him who is responsible for killing him, sees how he dies, he says, truly this man was the Son of God. In his sorrow, in his suffering, in being betrayed, he is serving. He is submitting. And that is the glory of our shepherd. He drains the cup of God's wrath down to the dregs for all who cling to him, even with weak faith. And so let us place our hearts in the hands of him who was victorious in the struggle to submit to the Father's will. And as we think about that question, Pierre asked us. Pierre asked you, and you, and you, and you, and you. How would you finish this sentence? We are most like Christ when what? You've probably heard a lot of answers. I know a common one at mission conferences that I've heard is we are most like Christ when we are sent, trying to stir up the passions for us to go and do something. But we saw from Judas's case, that's not always true. It doesn't matter. You can go halfway around the world to preach the gospel. You still bring the same heart with you. We are most like Christ when we submit to the Father. And so we can throw ourselves into the struggle to submit to his will by fixing our eyes on Christ, by taking our strength from him and the Spirit he has poured out on us through his sacrifice. And so no matter what he brings for us in the future, we will be right to the Father's will in prayer if we submit to the Father's will in prayer. That when we get together to pray on Saturday morning Zoom or Sunday morning or in our community groups or as a family, among the many things we're doing is training our hearts to receive what the Father gives us. And so let us, as Pierre encouraged us, be diligent in prayer and follow in the steps of our Savior. Close with prayer and then benediction.